Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. You enter the most exquisite palace in all of Christendom through gilded doors. Beneath your feet, the marble floors shine like mirrors, reflecting the dancing flames of 1,000 candles that light up the walls with precious oriental tapestries. As ladies of the court pass like ethereal spirits, the gentle rustle of silk gowns whispers promises of unimaginable wealth and power. Trailing across surfaces worth more than whole kingdoms are their jeweled fingers, the scent of roses and amber. The weight of centuries and the energy of ultimate power all contribute to the air's almost magical shimmer. You believe that this is it. The fairy tale has come true. The novel comes to life. You take a deep breath, prepared to inhale the essence of regal grandeur. Then it dawns on you that adorns desperately. The sweet, grasping scent tries to hide something much more human. The reality behind the fiction creeps into your mind like poison through silk, causing your eyes to moisten a little. This is neither the romantic period drama nor the Disney movie version of the sanitized fairy tale. Under those dazzling gowns and jeweled crowns, there were hygienic practices that would make a modern person shudder. This is the real life of medieval and Renaissance royalty. Even though she may be the head of a continent-spanning kingdom, the woman who is coming towards you in layers of golden brocade, her arms dripping with pearls the size of robin's eggs, hasn't taken a proper bath in months. With such magnificent courtly grace, the man bending before her governs nations and leads armies capable of destroying entire towns. However, there are enough lice on his filthy body to fill a small village, because the queen's breath might knock a horse down at 20 paces. The lady-in-waiting avoided looking at him as respectfully as possible and tried not to breathe through her nose. Greetings from the genuine royal court, where soap was optional, but authority was absolute, where the concept cleanliness was regarded as not only incorrect but also dangerously heretical, and where possessing divine right meant never having toe apologists for your body door. You have just entered a world where the most powerful women on the planet lived in filthy conditions that would make a contemporary homeless shelter cringe, where beauty regimens actually poisoned the beautiful, and where the desire for royal elegance resulted in walking monuments to human misery that are mind-boggling. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. First, taking a bath once a month. You work as a servant in the court of Queen Elizabeth I in 1580, as you receive the most dreaded task in all of England preparing. Her Majesty's weekly bath dawn breaks over Greenwich Palace, yes, once a month. With wealth that could purchase entire nations, the most powerful woman in the world hardly took a monthly bath. Even this frequency was deemed dangerously high by medical professionals. From kitchens where fires have burnt since midnight, 20 slaves carry bucket after bucket, lined with the finest linen to keep splinters from piercing royal flesh. The wooden tub sits like a medieval torture device. But the real terror starts here. Every day, Elizabeth applied layers of Venetian ceruse, a lead-based skin whitening product, without taking off earlier layers. The magnitude becomes evident as you assist the queen in taking off her garments. Her face is a patchwork of white paint that has been applied in stages and is cracked and flaking, geological layers of poison and vanity. The water instantly becomes murky with months' worth of collected makeup. When she goes into it, grease and sweat melt away. Like paint flaking from old buildings, the lead-based cosmetics spill off in sheets. It was impossible to describe the stench emanating from that tub. On top of months' worth of human fluids was the metallic temps of lead combined with vinegar-based cosmetics, all warming up to produce an alacritus attack capable of bringing down a mature man. As your eyes flood and your stomach turns, you have to stand and tend to your queen while you see dead skin peeling away in gray flakes mingled with brown stains from accumulated dirt and white lead residue. Like almost every other noble and royal on the continent, Elizabeth I used Venetian sushi, which is a concoction of white lead, vinegar, and water. However, thickness was not the nightmare. It was accumulation and consistency. The mask of toxicity became thicker every morning as new poison was applied on top of old poison. Every month, Marie Antoinette transformed her baths into theatrical productions. In the presence of courtiers and attendants, the French queen would take a bath in a full-length linen gown and occasionally have breakfast in the tub. Imagine the Queen of France soaking in her own squalor as she nibbled gently upon pastries and nobility engaged in courteous discourse. The psychological effects were disastrous. Even though their skin itched all the time, these women led armies. Deep, excruciating feelings of accumulated toxins leaking from their pores instead of just plain, unclean skin. Oils, dead skin, and hairstyle. Debris plagued Elizabeth's scalp. Lead caused hair loss, necessitating expensive wigs, which exacerbated the issue. Fessidest thing was how these queens marinated in filth and still retained their dignity. They pretended to be divine representatives, while gradually poisoning themselves in an attempt to meet unachievable beauty standards, held court while resisting the impulse to scratch, and made life-or-death decisions via ongoing bodily discomfort. The second is the nightmare of lead face paint. The actual horror is revealed as you approach Elizabeth I and her private quarters. There's more to her snow-white skin than makeup. Every morning, a fresh layer of the death mask is applied on top of the layer from the previous day and the weeks prior. The queen engaged in a gradual suicide ritual every morning. She woke up with the lead paint from yesterday, flaking and cracking like dry mud. Ladies in waiting did not remove previous layers before coming forward with a new solution of vinegar, water, and white lead. Washing and water were regarded as hazardous. Instead, they created an ever-thickening mask by painting new poison over old. Elizabeth I used Venetian sushi, a concoction of vinegar, water, and white lead, just like almost every other aristocrat and monarch on the continent. Day after day, year after year, the lead soaked through the skin, resulting in mood swings, memory issues, and unpredictable behavior. Courtiers observed that she lost discussions in the middle of sentences and that her anger grew erratic. Unaware that their queen was poisoning herself for pale beauty, they blamed it on pressures from the ruling class. The senses were overpowered by the scent alone. The characteristic metallic smell o fled is combined with a vinegar base and accumulated oils underneath. In order to avoid gagging during close interaction with the queen, one had to breathe via their mouth. The psychological toll was just as terrible. Courtiers saw, but were unable to comprehend the unexpected outbursts, memory loss, and paranoia caused by lead poisoning. A vicious cycle was produced by physical consequences. Hair loss from lead necessitated increasingly ornate wigs. Skin became puckered and grayed, necessitating thicker treatments to cover up damage. Courtiers learnt to stand at certain distances during audiences because it decayed teeth and produced breath so bad. These ladies were caught in vicious cycles of increasing toxicity, since the very solutions to their problems made them worse. It wasn't vanity. Addiction was the cause. In an era fixated on pale skin, the lead offered a fleeting feeling of perfection, a spectral force that symbolized divine purity. However, tolerance developed with time, turning what began as thin coatings into thick masks. Much like any addiction, skin becomes more and more discolored and damaged. The queens died slowly for an unachievable ideal that killed them from the inside, out as a result of becoming prisoners of their own quest for beauty. Third, the massive lice outbreak. According to legend, British King James I never took a bath, which led to lice infestations in the chambers he visited in the 17th century. However, this was more than a personal issue. Power meetings became exercises in not scratching due to the palace-wide infestation that transformed the top echelons of administration into a crawling horror. According to Lady Anne Clifford, she and her family were all miserable when they visited the king's quarters and sat in Sir Thomas Erskine's room. Think about that time. You are a high-ranking nobleman sitting for a meeting with the monarch, adorned in the finest jewels and silks. The first telltale tickling appears within minutes. Then another. Soon, parasites that have spread from wall hangings, furniture, and even the monarch are crawling all over your body. The lice were more than just a bother. They were carriers of sickness. More soldiers died from typhus spread by body lice than from actual combat. These microscopic beings, who feasted on royal blood, spread the plague from person to person among the highest echelons of society. Every bow, handshake, and private exchange turned into a chance to spread a fatal illness. For several months, James the Brighterly slept in the same clothing until it practically came apart. He wore his hat every day of the week. Every fiber turned into a parasite-breeding habitat. The royal chambers must have resembled the sets of a horror film. Insect-infested dark nooks, furniture that practically shifted with writhing lice, and the incessant scratching that reverberated through power corridors. The psychological torment was severe. Imagine attempting to negotiate diplomatically while experiencing severe itching throughout your body. Imagine trying to uphold your regal dignity during state ceremonies while parasites scuttle across your scalp. These nobility weren't just awkward. They were humans who were nearly driven insane by the relentless attacks of blood-feeding monsters. Everyone took part in collective denial during court ceremonies, which turned into horrible theater. Nobles would desperately attempt not to scratch while standing in intricate formation, bowing and curtsying according to precise tradition. Courtiers engaged in futile skirmishes against hordes of insects. The rustle of silk gowns blended with the faint sounds of fingernails on fabric. The intricate hairstyles worn by women became ideal breeding habitats before being coated with powder. Hair was combed, curled, and lubricated with a mixture of bear or animal fat. On top of that, fleas were almost everywhere due to poor hygiene and a lack of bathing. In order to scratch their heads, some stylish women carried long, thin sticks with claws. Imagine the everyday situation. Animal fat held the tall hair structures together, creating warm, humid conditions that were ideal for insect breeding. Every parasite within miles was drawn to the fat of the bear and ox, resulting in writhing ecosystems that are permanently housed in royal coffers. In order to provide brief respite, women carried elaborate scratching sticks, which were exquisite tools made of ivory or silver that were made especially to reach through hairstyles. The real horror, however, was the normalization of this. The persistent presence of parasites led to the development of court etiquette. There were sophisticated procedures for dealing with the fact that everyone was continuously afflicted, as well as appropriate methods and times for using scratching tools. The world's most powerful people lived like walking colonies of insects, remaining calm as they were gradually eaten alive. The fourth is the addiction to Venetian ceras. The widespread usage of Venetian ceras in European courts marked the pinnacle of the tragedy of royal beauty standards. It wasn't makeup. Queens were turned into walking zombies by slow-acting poison, as their beauty regimen actually destroyed them from the inside out. Their thoughts grew more and more mature. The concoction was surprisingly straightforward. To make a paste that dried to a ghostly wit appearance, white lead was pounded into a powder and combined with vinegar. However, the application process was a real nightmare. This was not something noblewomen wore on important occasions. They wore it daily, frequently reapplying it over weeks' worth of unwashed layers. Imagine the morning routine of a queen from the 16th century. Her face is peeling and cracked from yesterday when she wakes up. Women in waiting come bearing brushes and the well-known white paste. The water was hazardous, so they didn't clean it first. Rather, they cover old poison with new, making masks that get heavier every day until they reach weights that cause headaches and neck strains. It had disastrous psychological ramifications. Memory loss, mood changes, and paranoia are all symptoms of lead poisoning. Courtiers saw that their queens were becoming more and more unpredictable, prone to uncontrollable melancholy or outbursts of wrath, unaware that their sovereigns were gradually going insane due to vanity. They blamed changes on the strains of reigning. Horror shows were made with physical effects. Women donned increasingly ornate wigs to compensate for the hair loss caused by lead, which further harmed their scalps. Skin became puckered and grayed, necessitating increasingly thicker coatings to conceal damage. Worst of all, it decayed teeth and produced such awful breath that courtiers had to learn the proper distances for audiences to avoid retching and to be close enough to hear whispered commands. The circle of addiction was vicious. As skin grew, injured and discolored, tolerance increased. Yet each treatment offered a fleeting sense of perfection and ghostly power that symbolized holy purity. As women frantically attempted to conceal growing toxicity harm, what began as light dusting turned into heavy masks. They were imprisoned by their own desire for beauty, gradually dying for impractical ideals. Court doctors were aware of the risk, but they were unable to resist the demands of fashion. Symptoms of what we now know as heavy metal toxicity were described in medical texts from the time period that opposed lead-based cosmetics, but survival was subordinated to vanity. Rather than live a natural life, queens would like to die lovely. The last moments were terrifying. Advanced lead poisoning caused women to have a characteristic gray pallor that was impossible to cover up with makeup. Clumps of hair tumbled out of them. Their breath turned so bad that even handkerchiefs smeared with perfume couldn't cover up the stink, and their teeth turned black and fell out. However, they persisted in dousing themselves in new poison every morning, caught in a vicious circle of increasing toxicity that ultimately led to slow, excruciating death. What was more terrible was that these women virtually decomposed alive, while still maintaining their royal majesty. They signed death orders while paralyzed by lead, held audiences while their faces physically cracked and flaked, and controlled countries while gradually losing their mental faculties due to poisoning, fueled by vanity. 5. The mask of perfume. Perfume wasn't a luxury in the glamorous setting of unwashed royal courts. The stink of human decay was being combated by frantic chemical warfare. What they were urgently trying to conceal behind layers of stronger scents was more terrible than what they were wearing. Versailles and the surrounding accommodations housed more than 10,000 royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, and military officers at one point. Some males urinated off the balustrade in the center of the royal chapel, while women lifted their skirts up to urinate where they stood. Courtiers created entire societies around hiding the stench with ever more desperate methods, since it was so overpowering. Not fashion items, but survey vulgar, queens and noblewomen always carried sachets of fragrance pressed to their noses. Their progress through the corridors was marked by the scent of their perfumed gloves. They had oils in their hair that were so potent that they could be seen from other rooms. The harsh reality of unclean bodies, decaying teeth, and clothing that hadn't been laundered in months, however, was hidden beneath this fragrant armor. Queen Elizabeth I was very conscious of the value of her public persona, and the scent of flowers, amber, and musk permeated her court. However, this was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. At crucial state sessions, the alternative was to have courtiers faint from the stench. Frequently, the scent itself contributed to the issue. When applied to unwashed skin, it combined with perspiration and body oils to produce a fresh, even more repulsive smell. Imagine clawing amber or sickly sweet rose oil combined with months' worth of sweat. Frequently, the cocktails that were created were worse than the initial issues that they were meant to address. In every manufacturing war, court perfumers turned into military strategists. Instead of enhancing natural aromas, they created stronger and stronger mixtures that were intended to drown out human odor. Recipes need large amounts of civet, ambergris, and musk. Strong animal secretions that were odorous at long distances. These were phylactery sledgehammers meant to beat noses into obedience, not delicate smells. It had a significant psychological impact. Nobles developed an obsessive obsession with their own fragrances, monitoring and reapplying perfumes all day long. They created complex codes based on scent. Political alliances were indicated by certain fragrances. Others mentioned that they were available for romantic liaison. Others cautioned of illness or bad luck. The most unsettling aspect was how this led Tudor-based class hierarchies. Having the money to buy more powerful perfumes became a social status symbol, to the periphery of social gatherings and risked social exile. Instead of being merely fashion, women's garments evolved into fragrance delivery systems. Perfume compartments and concealed sachets were incorporated into gown designs. With every movement, fragrance was released from reservoirs of fragrant oils inside the sleeves in order to provide constant, fragrant coverage. Distressing aspect, though, was perhaps how this frantic disguising kept any practical solutions at bay. Courts did not solve hygienic issues. Instead, they merely intensified perfume arms races, with each season bringing stronger scents meant to drown out the smell of the preceding year, resulting in cycles of increasing olfactory assault that only temporarily alleviated the initial difficulties. The impression was stunning when taken as a whole. Palace underlying human rot blended with competing odors to create a thick, nearly unbreathable soup of air. Exposure to intensely perfumed surroundings was often associated with respiratory issues, headaches, and nausea. Courtiers, however, favored these symptoms over the exposed realities of royal hygiene. The lavatory attendant is number 6. This will make your skin crawl and make you reevaluate all you believed to be true about human depravity, power, and decency. In medieval England, the person who took care of the king's personal hygiene was highly esteemed and had power that generals and senators could only imagine. If you were very fortunate, and I use that phrase with the utmost irony, the King of England might designate you as the groom of his near stool. Your duties would include cleaning him afterward, carrying his portable toilet box around. However, cleaning up after royal toilet visits wasn't the only goal. In all of the kingdom, this was the most personal, humiliating, and politically significant position. In order to maintain the dignity and ceremony demanded by court procedure, the groom of the closed stool would have to physically grasp the king's waist, scrub his unclean posterior with rough cloth or bare hands, and cater to his most intimate bodily functions. For men who think they were chosen by God himself, they become human toilet paper. Imagine what this job would have been like on a daily basis under a king who hardly ever had a shower, ate enormous amounts of meat that rotted in his stomach, and had a body rife with open sores, infections, and illnesses that would have made a modern doctor shudder. You wake up every morning knowing that in a few hours you'll be kneeling behind England's most powerful man, scrubbing feces off areas of your body that haven't been cleaned in months, and breathing in air that smells like royal bowel movements, combined with unwashed flesh and festering wounds. The king's confidence and several court secrets were known to the stool's groom. Eventually, the stool's groom gained significant influence and took part in the highest levels of policy-making. His lowly responsibilities were not stigmatized. On the contrary, these men rose to become some of the most influential figures in the kingdom's politics because they were able to reach the monarch at his most vulnerable and private times. Consider the kind of personality this job requires. You're dealing with the actual waste of an unclean king whose body is rife with illnesses and open sores, fecal waste, unclean flesh, diseased wounds, putrid clothes, and whatever scents were being utilized to cover up the overall atrocity. You must, however, remain completely composed. Speak when someone speaks to you. Give advice when someone asks for it, and never, ever display distaste or disgust. This is where it becomes really unsettling from a psychological standpoint. Kings, these men, served forged, sincere emotional ties with them. They were the first to notice the monarch's illness, were aware of his medical vulnerabilities, closely monitored his body's processes, and exploited this personal information to their political benefit. They turned into reservoirs of the most heinous elements of absolute authority, human confessionals for crumbling royal bodies. While his groom knelt behind him with cleaning cloths, the king would frequently conduct business from his nearby stool, making decisions that would impact millions of lives. In halls filled with royal feces, treaties were negotiated, wars were proclaimed, and executions were mandated. While one man was cleaning the unclean backside of another, the most significant discussions in English history occurred. Think about the power relationships involved. Even though he had full power, the king was totally helpless and reliant in these situations. The king's bodily comfort and dignity were literally in the hands of the groom. Gaining access to restricted information, influencing policy, and forming relationships with other influential court individuals were all made possible by this intimate understanding of royal bodily processes. The job was frequently handed down from father to son, resulting in dynasties of royal toilet attendants who amassed property, money, and political power over many generations. The most private secrets of English royalty were known to these households, physical secrets as well as political ones. They were aware of which kings had hemorrhoids that bled continuously and which had chronic diarrhea, which ones, because of untreated medical issues, yelled in anguish when they had bowel movements. The most unsettling aspect of this arrangement was how it accepted the total deterioration of human dignity for the sake of power. Cleaning royal garbage was the ultimate court achievement, and young men vied for the honor. Parents hoped that their sons would be selected for this honor. The whole social order was so distorted that it was no longer a sign of degrading behavior, but of distinction to handle another man's feces, using different clothes for different functions, learning to anticipate the king's body rhythms, and knowing which foods trigger which kinds of stomach trouble. The grooms developed specialized ways for their work. They were frequently the first to recognize symptoms of illness or disease, which forced them to become medical professionals. Their discoveries might affect succession planning in the event that the king's health declines, schedule crucial meetings around digestion patterns, and even influence the royal diet. Though it's never mentioned in historical texts, these individuals must have suffered a great deal psychologically, despite dedicating their lives to the most heinous facets of human life. They were supposed to uphold loyalty, discretion, and dignity. They could never talk about what they saw, yet they knew more about their king's body than wives or doctors. While the fate of nations was decided above their heads, they sat in the most helpless posture possible, kneeling in human feces, yet wielded great political influence. Seventh, soap was condemned by the Spanish Inquisition. Perhaps the most psychologically unsettling element of royal hygiene is the tale of Queen Isabella of Castile. Cleaning became a crime, punishable by burning alive when the willful acceptance of filth evolved into a perverted kind of religious devotion that wiped out entire civilizations. According to Spanish Christian belief, taking a bath is a wicked behavior that only results in nudity. It was regarded as something unreligious and a kind of hedonism. However, this was more than just a matter of taste. It became official state policy, which made soap a devil's instrument and transformed hygiene into heresy. But the documented persecution of hygienic habits is real, horrifying, and one of the most organized attacks on fundamental human health in history. Imagine this horror's psychological structure. The most powerful woman in the realm has declared that cleaning your body is an act of rebellion against God Himself. And you are in 15th century Spain, with the support of the monarchy. The Church declares that having clean skin is a sign of moral decay, and that getting rid of dirt and grime also takes away God's grace. In their sermons, priests emphasize that going through filth is a way to experience Christ's agony on the cross. Muslims in Spain were forced to give up bathing in addition to their faith in order to survive the Inquisition after the Christians conquered Granada. Bathing was absolutely prohibited, and Isabella and Ferdinand ordered the destruction of the Muslim baths. Conversion to a different religion was not the only goal here. It concerned the methodical obliteration of a whole culture's perspective on human health and dignity. Consider the psychological torment this policy would cause. Your regular ablutions, which are essential to your faith and personal cleanliness, suddenly become a grave offense when you're a Muslim living under Christian control. Inquisitors would look for evidence of bathing in dwellings. If a heretic was found in possession of soap, clean clothes, or bathing supplies, they risked being burnt alive. Washing your face became proof of a covert Islamic ritual that may bring your entire family to ruin. The Inquisition created advanced techniques to identify bathing. They questioned neighbors about questionable washing practices, searched for houses that used excessive amounts of water, and looked into families whose clothes seemed overly clean. Youngsters were urged to report parents who took regular baths. The hygienic practices of their master were questioned by the servants. In order to identify and penalize cleanliness, the entire social structure was transformed into a surveillance network. Isabella was appalled when Columbus described the Bahamas and Caribbean inhabitants' daily bathing customs and ordered her new subjects to immediately put an end to this profane practice. It literally spread sickness and death in the name of Christian purity, forcing the hygienic, healthy native inhabitants of the Americas to give up their sanitary habits in favor of European filth. Imagine that initial point of contact. Native Americans whose daily bathing practices have kept them healthy for ages come into contact with Spanish conquistadors who have been unclean for months and are afflicted with illnesses unheard of in the Americas. The Spanish actively demolished the infrastructure that supported cleanliness in the new globe and proclaimed these superior hygiene methods to be demonic, rather than taking inspiration from them. The psychological effects on native populations were catastrophic. They were not allowed to follow the hygiene customs that had kept them safe for generations, and they watched as European illnesses wiped out their populations. Parents witnessed children pass away from illnesses that may have been avoided with basic hygiene. Priests in Spain clarified that God's will was to suffer through filth. Laws pertaining to blood purity were created by the Spanish, and they also covered personal hygiene. Families were required to demonstrate both Christian faith and Christian heritage. Generation to generation bathing habits were documented in genealogical records. You might not be eligible for certain jobs or social statuses if you were descended from folks who took regular baths. Cleanliness turned into racial proof that might be used to support enslavement, execution, or persecution. Worst of all, the Spanish spread this anti-sanitary philosophy throughout their kingdom. Local bathing customs were ruthlessly eradicated by colonial authorities and replaced with European filth everywhere from the Philippines to Mexico, Peru to the Caribbean. Traditional cleansing practices were outlawed under threat of death. Public baths were destroyed, and ancient aqueducts were abandoned. The medical repercussions were disastrous. Throughout Spanish territory, diseases that had been managed by conventional hygiene methods erupted. In formerly healthy populations, typhus, dysentery, and skin illnesses became endemic. By employing waste as a weapon against their own citizens, the Spanish unintentionally produced biological warfare on a large scale. The psychological foundation for this horror was ingrained in the era's Christian faith. Vanity, which was wicked, was linked to cleanliness. It was believed that going through bodily pain was a means of spiritual cleansing. One's spirit became more pure the more they endured physical suffering. Deliberately making oneself ill became a sign of religious devotion as a result of this warped incentive structure. Royal courts in Spain became arenas for competitive suffering. Nobles fought to see who could last the longest periods without taking a bath, who could tolerate the worst body odor, and who could get the most remarkable variety of parasite infections and skin conditions. What began as religious policy evolved into intentional self-harm as a kind of social rivalry. The long-term effects were felt even beyond Spain. Around the world, European colonization came to be associated with the devastation of sanitary infrastructure. There was a systematic suppression and loss of traditional knowledge regarding preventive cleaning, therapeutic washing, and medicinal bathing. Whole societies that had acquired advanced knowledge of hygiene were compelled to give up habits that had kept them healthy for thousands of years. Most regrettably, this was one of the biggest reversals of human progress in history. European Christianity was heading in the opposite direction, establishing ideological frameworks that transformed suffering into virtue and cleanliness into sin, while Islamic civilization, Asian cultures, and indigenous peoples around the world had developed increasingly complex approaches to hygiene and public health. The eighth is the milk bath scam. Imagine this horrifying instance of phony altruism that exposes the perverse psychology of royal privilege. The Hanover Countess Platen is lying in a bathtub of hot milk. A terrible malady, most likely syphilis, or a similar venereal disease that was destroying the European nobles like a plague of divine punishment for their sexual excesses, was rife throughout her body, according to historical accounts. However, this is not a scene of extravagance or luxury. This woman is so ill that she has open sores all over her skin. Parts of her nose were probably eaten away by the virus that ravaged her body, leaving her breath smelling of decaying flesh. The milk bath is not a cosmetic procedure. It's a last-ditch effort to temporarily alleviate the excruciating pain of advanced varier disease by soothing skin that feels like it's burning from the inside out. Countess Platen Hanover bathed in milk while afflicted with a painful illness and he kindly gave the tainted milk to the underprivileged. This act's psychological cruelty is astounding and betrays a level of heartless disrespect for human life that is beyond the current understanding. This woman was so ill that her mere presence could spread to others. In an apparent gesture of Christian kindness, she decided to soak in milk and then give the tainted liquid to starving peasants. Imagine this kind donation being given to a low-income family. Winter is coming, food is in short supply, you are starving, and your kids are undernourished. Then a servant from the aristocratic family shows up with what looks to be a heavenly present for your family. Fresh milk could be the difference between life and death. You take it with gratitude, maybe even offering prayers of gratitude for the Countess' kindness. There is no way for you to know that the bodily fluids of a lady who is dying of venereal disease have tainted this milk. The microscopic organisms that presently swim in the drink you're going to give your kids are invisible to you. You fail to see that this charity is really a conduit for the transmission of sickness from the palace to the city's poorest neighborhoods. The generosity of your benefactor is a death sentence disguised as goodwill. The Countess herself probably thought she was carrying out her Christian obligation. The psychological symptoms of severe syphilis muddled her damaged mind. She was giving to people in need of her riches. The moral calculus of the moment seemed to disregard the fact that her abundance was actually tainted by her own filthy bodily fluids. She was overflowing with possessions. The impoverished possessed less than they needed. Therefore, regardless of the repercussions, sharing was morally right. This illustrates how royal courts were marked by a deep psychological divide between aristocracy and common humanity. The Countess lived in a society where her physical wants were more important than the lives of hundreds of impoverished families, and she was comfortable and convenient. It just didn't seem morally significant that her bathing habits could kill innocent people. Since they were impoverished, her brief respite from illness was worth far more than their lives. However, this was not a singular instance of personal brutality. This was an example of a structural issue that beset European royal courts: the unintentional spread of illness among the people they ruled by affluent, sick aristocrats. Death spread across the continent as a result of such deeds of kindness. Food prepared by royal cooks who were ill. Clothes inherited from aristocrats who were sick. Clergy members with a variety of illnesses sharing communion wine. Even having sex with sick nobles who were unable to turn down royal advances. Through all of their interactions with the general populace, the royal courts unintentionally turned into hubs for biological warfare, disseminating illness. Wedding festivities, in which hundreds of guests were fed and drank by ailing nobility. Infected priests handled communion items touched by innumerable lips during religious rites. During public appearances, sickly royalty would shower audiences with blessed items that spread the plague from the palace to the countryside. When recipients of such donations learnt the reality, the psychological effects were severe. Families who had applauded the Countess's charity as their children perished from illnesses brought on by her milk had to face the terrible truth that their benefactor had killed them out of altruism. In reality, the exact deed they had hailed as proof of heroic virtue was murder masquerading as altruism. The most unsettling aspect was that this trend persisted for generations without anyone taking note of the repercussions. Similar occurrences involving other lords who sent impoverished villages with tainted food, dirty clothing, and diseased cattle are documented in court documents. It appeared that the nobles were unable to comprehend that their illnesses could have an impact on others. Or maybe they just didn't care enough about the average person to think about the repercussions of what they were doing. Willful blindness was just as much a factor in these atrocities as the medical incompetence of the era. Some court physicians were sufficiently knowledgeable about the spread of disease to recommend against such practices. However, when their cautions clashed with noble convenience or vanity, they were disregarded, even when it resulted in widespread deaths among vulnerable communities. The urge to seem altruistic took precedence above public health concerns. This was the ultimate perversion of Christian altruism, converting charitable deeds into weapons of mass destruction and moral impulses into biological weapons. The Countess most likely passed away thinking she had led a compassionate and giving life, never realizing that her generosity had killed more people than willful malice ever could. 9. The terror of hair. Royal ladies' intricate hairdos served as more than just fashion accessories. A modern individual would throw up on the spot and flee in terror from any room where such horrors were present, because they were transportable ecosystems of dirt, decay, and living parasites. While their hosts remained perfectly composed in public, these imposing monuments to vanity were essentially biological catastrophes that turned human heads into breeding grounds for monsters that consumed royal flesh. Bear or ox fat was mixed with excellent oil, hair was combed, curled, and finally powdered. On top of that, fleas were almost everywhere due to poor hygiene and a lack of bathing. The actual misery of royal hair care during the medieval and Renaissance eras is hardly covered by the fact that certain stylish women carried long, thin sticks with claws for scratching their heads. Imagine how these gigantic monuments to vanity are built on a regular basis. Before the sun rose, slaves who had been selected for hair duty started the procedure. First, rendered animal fat made in royal kitchens, from bear or ox corpses, would be applied to the queen's natural hair, or what was left of it, after months of chemical destruction and parasite infection. This was thick, putrid grease that smelt and felt like rotting meat, not refined processed fat like the compounds found in current cosmetics. Just the smell would have been too much to handle. When animal fat matures and becomes rancid, its unique, sickening smell gets exponentially worse. This, combined with unwashed human hair that hadn't been thoroughly cleansed in weeks or months, seasoned with the buildup from past styling sessions and heated by body heat, produced an olfactory onslaught that could knock a grown person to the ground. However, the odor was only the start. Every bug within miles was drawn to the grease, resulting in a writhing biosphere that made the queen's coiffure its permanent home. Like moths, toa, flame, fleas, lice, ticks, and other flying insects were attracted to the warm, humid atmosphere. They established breeding colonies that transformed royal heads into living insect cities, and they didn't simply come to visit, they settled there permanently. Insects weren't merely travelers. Every minute of every day, they were active players in a biological horror show that was being performed on the queen's scalp. In order to provide their young with food and a nursery, fleas would lay their eggs in the grease in order to create tunnels and chambers where they could safely reproduce. Lice would burrow beneath accumulated layers of fat and dead skin. As the queen slept, performed official duties, and participated in religious rituals, her head turned into a maternity facility for parasites that fed on her blood. This biological stew was covered with a powder that had several uses, none of which were hygienic. In addition to providing trendy coloring, blue, pink, gold, or conventional white tit was meant to absorb extra grease. However, it soon combined with the animal fat, insect feces, and accumulated dirt to form a pastel-like mixture that solidified into a filth helmet that was impossible to remove without actually slicing it off the scalp, because the construction process was so costly and labor-intensive. Women's hair was frequently left in these intricate styles for weeks at a time. The biological ecology kept developing and growing during this time. Scavenger insects that consumed decaying substances would find food in the layers of dead insects that accumulated, with predators, prey, and decomposers all residing in the same little space. The queen's hairstyle turned into a full food chain. Perhaps more devastating than the physical terror was the psychological toll. While their scalps were crawling with vermin that were constantly moving, eating, reproducing, and dying, these women had to remain perfectly composed. To temporarily alleviate the itching and crawling feelings, ladies carried special scratching sticks, which were simply long ivory or silver picks, embellished with diamonds matching their dresses. Ladies could covertly place these sticks into their hairstyles. Imagine having parasites literally gnawing at your scalp while you were attempting to hold a diplomatic discussion. Imagine trying to keep your dignity as a king or queen during religious rituals while insects scuttled down your neck and across your forehead. Despite the continual impulse to rip their intricate hairstyles apart and itch till they drew blood, these women had to speak clearly, smile, and nod. The actual structures were frequently left in place for 2 to 3 weeks and may take 6 to 8 hours to build. The hair underneath would tangle and mat throughout this period, making it an even better environment for bacteria and insects to thrive. Some ladies experienced permanent bald spots when their natural hair was totally damaged by the weight and ongoing insect activity. Others experienced persistent infections of the scalp, which led to open lesions that further drew parasites. Courtiers created complex codes to position themselves during audiences, since the stench from these haircuts was so overpowering. In close conversations, everyone knew to breathe through their mouths, to keep perfumed handkerchiefs on hand that they might covertly put to their noses when the stink grew too strong, and to avoid standing upwind of the queen if possible. The most unsettling aspect, though, was perhaps how this horror was accepted as the pinnacle of refinement and style. Your social standing increased with the complexity of your hairstyle, the number of insects it could support, and the strength of its scent. Women fought to create the tallest, most intricate, parasite-infested hair sculptures. What ought to have been a public health emergency turned into a fashion contest, with the most repulsive head of hair in the kingdom as the winner. Teams of servants risked their health to create these hairstyles in order to satisfy royal vanity, because extended exposure to the odor and insect activity could result in respiratory issues, parasitic infections, and nausea. Hairstylists worked in shifts. They created specific equipment for handling live insects, methods for avoiding the highest vermin concentrations, and plans for finishing tasks as soon as possible to reduce exposure. Tragically, these women frequently knew what they were doing to themselves but felt unable to stop it due to the strong social pressure. According to court documents, noblewomen sent private letters expressing distaste for their own hair care regimens, lamenting the ongoing discomfort and itching and wishing for easier, more hygienic methods of beauty. However, they were constrained by societal norms that prioritized fashion over fundamental human dignity, status over comfort, and looks above health. 10. The disaster at Versailles. Louis XIV's Versailles is the ultimate horror tale of royal hygiene, as the Sun King's choice to consolidate his court resulted in what may have been the filthiest setting in European history, a place so filthy that it resembles the Garden of Eden compared to modern sewage treatment systems. Versailles and its surrounding accommodations housed over 10,000 royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, and military officers. At one point, this resulted in a concentration of biological decay, disease, and human waste that defied all natural sanitation laws, turning the world's most beautiful palace into a gilded hellhole of unfathomable proportions. Even though Versailles was known for its grandeur, the living conditions of its royals and staff were no better than the impoverished conditions found in many European cities during that era. Some males urinated off the balustrade in the center of the royal chapel, while women lifted their skirts up to urinate where they stood. This was not sporadic emergency assistance in a palace with more inhabitants than most cities, but almost no functional restrooms. This was the standard acceptable way to handle bodily functions. Imagine traversing the world's most renowned palace in its prime, with its golden walls glowing in candlelight, exquisite artwork covering every surface, and mirrors reflecting many pictures of grandeur and wealth. However, your feet splatter through urine pools that seep into expensive imported carpets, no matter where courtiers happen to be standing. The sound of dripping liquid reverberates through the hallways as they relieve themselves. Expensive perfumes and the stench of human waste combine to produce an olfactory nightmare that tears your eyes and burns your nostrils. As she passed through an interior courtyard, Marie Antoinette was reportedly struck by human waste flung out the window, according to historian Tony Sporforth. Think about that time. Human feces truly rain from the sky onto the Queen of France's ornate gown as she walks through her own palace, adorned in silks and gems, worth more than entire provinces. This was no strange mishap. There was nowhere else for rubbish to go. Thus, it was common practice to toss it out windows on Tuesdays at Versailles. The human load caused by the Sun King's ego was simply too much for the infrastructure to support. Louis XIV had permanently relocated his court to Versailles, putting more people in one place than the structure could have possibly accommodated. Blockages and corrosion in the palace's iron and lead pipes were known to sometimes contaminate everything in Marie Antoinette's kitchen, and the heavily used latrines frequently spilt into the apartments below. Imagine being the Queen of France and having regions where you prepare meals contaminated by sewage. Imagine attempting to uphold royal dignity during a state meal when human feces, practicalispal, over your dining table from the ceiling. Everyone must have been overwhelmed by the psychological strain of surviving in such conditions while upholding the myth that this was the pinnacle of civilization and elegance. Spoor claims that not even the royal children's rooms were secure. Excrement was as ubiquitous as silk and jewels, and the future kings and queens of France grew up in what was effectively a lovely cesspit. Puddles of human waste in palace halls taught children who would one day govern empires to walk the air they breathed was heavy with the odor of 10,000 people's bodily functions as they played games. There must have been an unfathomable stench permeating the mansion. The stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, decaying food, sick wounds, and whatever perfumes people used to try to hide the horror would have permeated the air. As there were only rudimentary sewage systems that sometimes backed up or overflowed with 10,000 people producing waste every day. Breathing became a willpower exercise that needed ongoing mental preparation, but the physical anguish was only one aspect of the psychological horror, the epicenter of civilization, the height of human achievement, and the physical embodiment of divine order were all intended to be here. Ambassadors traveled from all over the world to observe French elegance and grace. Rather, they were forced to negotiate diplomatically with folks whose breath could render them unconscious, and who hadn't taken a bath in months while wading through human feces. The courtiers' complex coping strategies demonstrate the extent of their psychological adjustment to horror. They discovered which parts of the palace were the safest and had the least amount of rubbish buildup. They created codes to alert one another to new excrement deposits. They developed breathing techniques that reduced their exposure to poisonous air, ways to position themselves during rituals to avoid the worst odors, and ways to move through hallways without treading in human excrement. The fact of living in a human cesspit led to the evolution of court etiquette. There were sophisticated procedures for handling circumstances where waste disposal conflicted with court ceremonies, appropriate places to urinate during religious ceremonies, and appropriate ways to relieve yourself during royal audiences. The most advanced social structure in European history adapts to operate under circumstances that would have appalled peasants in the Middle Ages. The women's ornate dresses were transformed into portable waste disposal units. Part of the purpose of the numerous layers of skirts and petticoats was to conceal the fact that women were urinating in their standing positions. As women went about their everyday lives, the bulky textiles absorbed liquids and transported waste out of the immediate vicinity, dispersing it throughout the palace. Everywhere court ladies walked, biological contamination was distributed by fashion, which turned into a kind of sewage distribution. The most unsettling aspect was how kids who grew up in this setting began to accept it as the norm. The psychological frameworks created by young aristocrats who lived at Versailles their entire lives normalized living in human excrement. Since they had never encountered anything different, they were really unaware that there were alternatives to these conditions. Many of them suffered from culture shock when they finally left Versailles for other places and saw basic sanitary conditions. The health effects were disastrous and foreseen. At the Versailles, diseases that were transmitted by fecal pollution grew endemic. In waves, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread throughout the court, killing both aristocrats and commoners. Court physicians, however, attributed the illnesses to poor air quality, moral decay, or divine retribution for different transgressions, rather than tackling the fundamental sanitation issues. By any contemporary measure, the working conditions endured by the palace employees would be considered cruel and unusual punishment. Cleaning staff were required to work in hazardous conditions, which caused many of them to acquire long-term respiratory issues. Despite being surrounded by potentially fatal biological risks, they were supposed to preserve the splendor of the palace. Numerous people who were exposed to human excrement on a regular basis suffered chronic ailments. However, as royal service was frequently their only chance of survival, they were unable to resign. The fact that this horror was spread as a template for royal courts throughout Europe was perhaps the sadist, without realizing they were actually replicating a public health catastrophe. Other kings who had visited Versailles attempted to replicate its splendor when they went home. The horror was multiplied, and networks of royal cesspits were established as the Versailles model expanded throughout European palaces, competing to accommodate more people in filthier circumstances. Although it is rarely mentioned in historical chronicles, Louis XIV himself must have experienced a significant psychological impact. He had to live in this atmosphere every day, even if he had built it as a tribute to his own pride. He saw the same degeneration as everyone else, smelt the same overpowering stink, and breathed the same poisonous air. Since acknowledging the issue would jeopardize the authority he was attempting to establish, his quest for absolute power had imprisoned him in a prison of human garbage from which he could never free himself. As a result, the entire ancient system was marked by a total disconnection between appearance and reality. In paintings and descriptions, Versailles appeared wonderful, but in reality, its residents had to endure a daily nightmare of biological agony that gradually drove them insane due to the discrepancy between what they were meant to symbolize and what they actually experienced. The psychological underpinnings of the French Revolution were ultimately influenced by this discrepancy between royal mythology and royal actuality. As the general populace realized that their ostensibly superior rulers were, in fact, living like animals in a golden cage constructed out of their own garbage, one thing becomes clear as we take a step back from these terrifying insights into the realities of royal life. The fantasy of pristine, attractive royalty is just that, a fantasy created by those who were spared the hardships of everyday life. These were not tales of soiled characters dressed nicely. Vanity, tradition, and societal pressure combined to produce living conditions that would be considered torture by any modern measure, trapping these human beings in biological nightmares of their own creating. The noble women and queens we have met were not monsters. They were victims of structures that prioritized status over fundamental human decency, ritual over comfort, and appearance above health. They endured bodily suffering throughout their lives, which would drive people crazy in the modern world. Despite practically crawling with parasites and gradually poisoning themselves with their own beauty regimens, they remained composed, controlled nations, and molded history. Remember these forgotten princesses after you end this film and resume your tidy, contemporary existence. Keep in mind that these were just folks beneath all the trophies and pomp, people caught in birth accidents and unbearably uncomfortable lives, striving to remain human as their bodies betrayed them day in and day out, year in and year out, until death finally freed them from their gilded prisons of filth. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nestware. Every night, a new story takes flight.